Today we are going to be talking about the last, I think 9 books that I DNF'd. The last time I did a video like this was about 2 years ago, and that's about how long it takes for me to build up a list worth talking about. Not because I do not regularly DNF things, but because I'm only counting things that actually made it to my spreadsheet. And this gets into a whole discussion about like, how do you consider a book to be read or not? Should DNFs count as being read? I know people have a lot of feelings about that. For me, I only mark it in my spreadsheet if it was enough of a reading experience that I feel like it justifies counting towards my overall number of books I read in a given month. And that's actually not very frequent. I bail on books all the time, but usually it's at about the 10 to 20% mark. It's rare that I get past that and keep going if I'm not having a good time. Usually the only reason I would do that is if it's for some kind of challenge. So, you know, in general, if I'm not having a good time in a book, I will bail on it. I may mention it in my wrap up or in my mid-month check-in, but it's not something that's going to like really stick with me or one that I fully count as having a full reading experience with it. So the 9 books we're going to talk about, I got far enough into it to count it as a reading experience, or it was such a negative reading experience that I ended up counting it. So do with that what you will. I know I know that there's a lot of feelings about like how to count a DNF, which I should mention. DNF stands for did not finish, so these are books I did not complete. And I should also mention that I know some of you guys cannot DNF books, that if you start it, you're gonna finish it. That just is what it is. And I urge you to consider reevaluating that, because before I started DNFing things, I had a far lower average rating because I would just finish things I wasn't enjoying. And for me, personally, life is just too short to read things you're not having a good time in. But anyway, all that's neither here nor there. Let's talk about these 9 books. So first of all, I have The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. And the reason that I DNF'd this one is, frankly, I found this book incredibly triggering. I know that this book is very popular, and I can definitely see from the writing style that I can see the appeal. It's not that it's a mystery to me why people like this book. It's a very competently written book with a very compelling authorial voice, but the subject matter is intrinsically tied up with self-harm and suicidal ideation. And I just feel like that is not talked about enough for this particular book, and that people are way too casual in recommending it. I knew that potentially was a part of the premise, because I knew it was sort of an If It's a Wonderful Life kind of take. I guess to the author's credit, he's very effective at putting you in the mindset of somebody experiencing those thoughts. And if you are somebody who has ever experienced those thoughts, it had been years since I had that kind of thought, and reading this book put me back in that mindset and like really, like, it kind of ruined my day. So for that reason, I DNF'd it, and I do feel strongly about continuing to tell people about it, because I think that is really important information for you to have before you choose to read this book, in case that is something that you may not have the right headspace to read. So that is why I DNF'd that one, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad book, but I do think it's one that needs a lot stronger and more discussed content warnings from people who are just sort of like blithely recommending it on Book Talk, which I see sometimes, and I'm like, guys, like let's have a little bit more thoughtfulness on this one. The next one is The Dark Side of the Road by Simon Green, which is a mystery thriller kind of thing. So the reason that I picked this one up is that I had seen it mentioned on a few different lists for isolated closed circle mysteries, which you guys know is my absolute favorite trope. There's at least one more of those on this list. Oh, actually, no, 2 more that I thought would be in this category, which is basically where everybody gets lured to a place, somebody dies, you got to figure out who done it before you get got. And this has also a supernatural element to me. Listen, the problem with this is that it took way too long for somebody to die. For one of these books, I think you should have at least a suggestion of menace at about the 20% mark, but like, I don't think somebody died until the 40 or 45% mark of this. And I by that point, I was just mad because I didn't like the main character. I thought he was incredibly just condescending and unpleasant. He was boring and unlikable, which to me is just an unforgivable combination. You gotta be at least interesting or likable, preferably both, but you gotta be at least one or the other. And if you're neither, I don't want to read about you. And so at that point, I just threw my hands up and was like, no more, I cannot do this. The next one I wanted to mention is also an isolated closed circle mystery, and this is Rock, Paper, Scissors. So I read this in the wake of my infamous experience reading Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney, which if you know, you know, that book really made me mad. And so I had Rock, Paper, Scissors on my TBR as well, and I thought, well, I probably should go ahead and try to read this just to see, is this just I don't like this author? And I don't know. I am gonna read one more from the author, somewhat because I'm a troll, but my hypothesis is I just don't like this author because I thought the writing was really affected in a way that did not work for me. The writing voice really didn't work for me. And then so I was not vibing, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna skip to the end and see if this ending is as bad as the one in Daisy Darker. And while I don't think it's quite as just egregious as what Daisy Darker does, which, side note, in Daisy Darker, the whole time I was like, well, this is obviously what's being built up, but there's no way she's gonna do this because this is so, like, this is a known horrible cliche. There's no, and then she did it. It wasn't quite that bad, but it was close. And so I DNF'd it in disbelief and disgust. So there you go. And I guess while we're at it, let's just round out the isolated closed circle mysteries. The other one that so this one I actually put a note about it on Goodreads because I did go ahead and give it 3 stars on Goodreads, but I put a disclaimer at the front saying like, hey, I got about a third, 40% of the way in, and then I skimmed to read the ending. And I think other people might like this, but I did not, because I thought it was going to be an isolated closed circle mystery. The setup is supposed to be around people on their baby moon, and then something goes really, really wrong. And is she gonna have the baby while somebody's trying to kill them in this isolated place? I thought that it was reading, though, much more like a domestic suspense, which is not necessarily my vibe. And I also thought that the back of the book was not matching the story because there were these dual timelines, and like, it just wasn't giving me that isolated vibe that I enjoy. When I got to the ending, some of the things I thought were plot holes were on purpose. I personally did not like the way that they were on purpose. I thought they were kind of stupid. But I was like, okay, if you're more into domestic suspense than me and you're not mad at this kind of a twist, I could see somebody liking it. But for me, I did not. I kind of like skim read the back half of it, so I kind of consider that to be a DNF. And yeah, not for me. So those were all of the isolated closed circle mysteries that did not work for me. Okay, and then a couple of speculative ones, let's say. A Lesson in Vengeance by, I think, Victoria Lee. This is one where the writing, actually, yeah, the next 2 were both like writing problems that I had. So A Lesson in Vengeance is a YA horror, dark academia, gothy kind of vibe. And I just thought the writing was so overwrought, so over the top, which, to be fair, when I was a teen, I could see myself liking. So for basically my feeling on this is I don't recommend this to adult readers, but I could see a teen reader getting into that vibe. And I should also say, in general, if you just are not bothered by sort of purple prose that's very melodramatic, you might be able to get on with this one better. But for me, it just was a no. It was a no. Nar. And the Atlas 6, same issue. I hated the writing in this. And it was so, oh God, I'm trying to remember it. Like, it was one of the ones that I put in the category of my eyeballs rejected it because it just was so much. The way I would describe the problem I had with this version of writing is that she took about 2 paragraphs to describe something that could have been encapsulated in a sentence. And therefore, not only was that dramatically overwritten, so like way too much writing to describe something, but it also made time move in such a weird way in the book that I just couldn't deal with it at all. So the Atlas 6 for me is so overhyped, mostly on the strength of the writing, because there wasn't enough in the characters or plot that I got through that I felt like made the writing issues I had worth it. And then the last speculative one, I guess, that I'll mention is Thunderhead by Neil Shusterman. Look, I've talked about this several times at this point. I think that the problem with this one was that I let way too much time go between Scythe and Thunderhead, so I just wasn't as invested at that point. And Thunderhead is a much different kind of book than Scythe was. So for that reason, it just wasn't giving me what I was interested in anymore. And I did skip to the ending because I'd heard the ending was like, oh my God. And yeah, I mean, I guess it was, but I just didn't care enough. So at some point I'll fully let go of that series. I'm holding on to Thunderhead and The Toll in hopes that I get in the mood to do a full reread, but more and more time is passing and that seems less and less likely. So that was just I messed up on how to read it, because I think if I'd read it right away, I probably could have gotten into it a little bit more. Okay, and then two more. Both of these are mysteries. So The Girl on the Train, this is actually a very constructive DNF, because I think I talked about this in my Reading the Goodreads Choice Award winners for mystery for the last 10 years video. I talked about this at length in that video. I think it was helpful for me to revisit it because I had DNF'd it once already, and revisiting it with more books read under my belt, I think gave me a fresh perspective on it to say like, you know, I don't like this, but I can quantify why I don't like it much better. And it's not for me. It has a perspective on what realism is that I find to not be true and to be less interesting than having characters who are more rounded and like they're flawed but not just scumbags, basically. I think having well-rounded characters where there are things to like and to dislike about them makes for a more compelling read, in my opinion, because you have something more to root for. So I don't know. I think that this was like the influence of Gone Girl and like the height of us being obsessed with the anti-hero kind of vibe. And that's just never been something that really resonated with me, on top of it being something more like a domestic suspense. Yeah, just all in all, not for me. And then finally, Desperation in Death, which is kind of a shocking one because you guys know how much I love the In Death series, but that particular one just was very dark in the mystery and its tone. It was not subject matter that I was particularly interested in making myself get through. It was a lot of like just darkness with assault and with children and grooming, and it just was too much. And so I kind of skimmed it to try to find some of the key character moments so that I didn't lose if anything big happened. But I will tell you, from what I could tell, not that much big character-wise happens in that one. So I think if you don't want to subject yourself to that, that's one you could potentially skip. For me, I just sort of did a light skim read and waited for the next one because it was just not what I was in the mood to read. So there you go. Those are the last 9 books that I DNF'd where I have something, you know, meaningful to say about them. They were some sort of a significant reading experience to one degree or another because, you know, for whatever reason they made it into the spreadsheet. And so yeah, it'll probably be about 2 years before I do this video again. But I do think that this is helpful to check in with myself and kind of get an audit of what doesn't work for me. I definitely think that some of this is genre preference and writing style. I think that those are two, oh, and I guess like triggering things or things that I just don't want to read about. Those are kind of the 3 common denominators here. At some point I need to do a 5-star audit. Meg with Books did this original video idea, which I thought was brilliant, and I do want to do that at some point. But this is sort of the reverse of that, which is like a DNF audit. So what does not work for me and what are things that I can avoid, you know, if possible in the future. So with all that being said, definitely let me know what you thought about any of the books I talked about. Let me know how you approach DNF in terms of, do you think that it counts as reading? How much of something do you have to read to count it as a book you've read? Like anything you want to share about the whole DNF debacle, because I feel like this is one of those perennial topics for debate that comes up around and around on the bookish internet. So let me know that in the comments below. And yeah, I think that will do it for me. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I think that will do it. I hope you have an absolutely lovely day today, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!